Hi guys, this lecture is looking at revisiting physical activity and a lot of the content that we would have looked at in the first part of the semester last year. So let's just look at the term physical activity and remind ourselves that physical activity is made up of four different domains. We've got transport, we've got domestic, we've got occupational, and we've got leisure. So in terms of last year, we looked at how much physical activity we should be doing. In 1995, we had the first, I suppose, public health guidelines for physical activity, where the American College of Sports Medicine would have advised us to do at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity on most, preferably all days of the week, and that could be accumulated. Now, there was many aspects of that prescription that were quite vague. So in 2008, it was updated to say that adults should really try to aim for 5 days a week of 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity, or 3 days a week of 20 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity, or indeed a combination of both. There was also mention of flexibility exercises, strengthening activities, and also that there was a dose response effect, whereby if you achieved beyond 150 minutes of moderate intensity or 60 minutes of vigorous, that there was greater health benefits. Now, in 2018, because of newer research that was published, it was basically stated that the pressure, I suppose, to achieve a threshold of 150 minutes a week wasn't something that we should really emphasize anymore. That really, if we can take people who do absolutely no physical activity and try to encourage them to increase their physical activity by any amount, that they will see some benefits. And because of that research, point number 2 here was also relevant, where the minimum bouts of 10 minutes were no longer important. So in terms of whether we're reaching these physical activity guidelines or not, in a word, I suppose the majority of us are not meeting the physical activity guidelines. The best data we can rely on is the Healthy Ireland survey from 2019. That indicated that 46% of adults in Ireland are meeting the physical activity guidelines, or 54% aren't, whichever way you'd like to look at it. That is an increase of from 44% in 2017. So we are seeing small increases in total physical activity. However, we're seeing inequities in terms of who is being physically active. We see more men are being physically active than women, and we also see a reduction in the proportion of people meeting the physical activity guidelines as age increases. So two things we can take from that women are less likely to be physically active and should be targeted with programs, and older adults equally should be targeted with programs. When we look at adolescents, we know that the guidelines for children are 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and approximately 90% plus of adolescents in Ireland are not meeting those physical activity guidelines. Again, the proportion meeting the guidelines reduces in teenage years as they increase in age, as they get older, and also females are less likely to be physically active. Globally, the prevalence of inactivity ranges from 23% in Central and Eastern Europe to up to 36.8% in all high-income countries. And we can see here, this slide is showing us the prevalence of inactivity. And we can see that in high-income countries, the prevalence of inactivity is actually rising. So, physical activity, is it good for us? Physical inactivity, is it risky for our health? In terms of inactivity, we know that physical inactivity is the 4th leading cause of death worldwide. We know that being physically inactive is a risk factor in and of itself. That basically means that your level of overweight is completely independent to the risk posed to being physically inactive. So what does that mean? That someone basically who's lean, who's lean but also sedentary is not protecting themselves from chronic disease. We know that in 2018, this scientific report added a range of different health issues that are improved through not just achieving the physical activity guidelines, but by doing any physical activity at all. So we should ask ourselves now at this point, well, why aren't we physically active? Why are more people not being physically active? Well, we know that physical activity has declined hugely over the years. We're seeing slight increases now in Ireland anyway. That's not been replicated around the world. Technology is a major reason why we're being physically inactive. While we are making great strides in increasing leisure time physical activity, we can't say the same for transport, for domestic, and for occupational. And even now, we can see far more how physical activity has been eroded from our lives. It's worth pointing out that this actual document, if you Google this document, download it, save it, it's the closest thing you'll have to a textbook in physical activity. Really, really useful. Not just for the health benefits of physical activity, but also it contains a lot of data about physical activity interventions, which would be really useful for you for this module. I'm going to finish on this slide. This is looking at this whole idea of the active couch potato, which we addressed last year. The active couch potato is a phenomenon where scientists found that in people who meet the physical activity guidelines, if they sat a lot, they still were at increased risk of chronic disease. Now, Ekelund, this paper here, Ekelund et al. Gave us some hope in that he said that that's not always the case. Because if the physical activity that people are doing is greatly in excess of the physical activity guidelines, and in this case, he suggested 60 to 75 minutes per day, that then you can eliminate the increased risk of high sitting time. And high sitting time, we could define as somewhere around 8 hours a day. The one caveat or exception here is that if that high sitting time is actually watching TV, then you're not protected by this amount of physical activity. So we can trade off sitting by being very physically active. But we have to ask ourselves, how many people are able to get 60 to 75 minutes of physical activity a day? Probably not that many outside of you guys. It's a big ask for people. So that's the reason we need this module is, well, how do you get people to be physically active then? Who, which is the easier one, we know who, but how is the bigger question. How are we going to get people to increase the physical activity they take? And that's the main focus of this module.